Mason lot. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Basically, this site was found rather accidentally. We were running ground penetrating radar around the area of the Windsor Palisade. And maybe you guys have heard that the Windsor area, the center of the old Windsor, was palisaded in during, basically during the Pequot War period around 1635, 1637. And that palisade was probably in place for another decade. It might have been rebuilt. I've heard rumors it was rebuilt during King Philip's War, 1675. But for a long time, there was this sort of protective structure around the core of old Windsor Center where the Windsor Historical Society was. So while we were running that radar, pretty unsuccessfully, I thought it was going to be the easiest thing in the world to find because we had good descriptions of this thing, and it was supposed to be, this big wide trench that I was going to find with the radar, boom, and be done. People had been looking for it for a long time, but I knew with modern technology we just stumbled right across it quickly, and it didn't happen. But what we did find was a big rectangular hole in the ground under the backyard of one of the houses in the southeast corner of the old Palisado. And we kind of knew from maps done in the 1650s that that had been John Mason's house lot. Now, hopefully you guys have heard of John Mason. He's the one who kind of led the Pequot War with John Underhill, the two Johns, against the Pequots, and was really in charge of the Connecticut militia for many, many years. His family then goes on to work very closely with the Mohegan tribe, and then also sort of tried to go to court in their favor during the big Mohegan land court battle that went on for over 50 years. So as we explored this, what we knew was probably a filled-in cellar feature just from its shape. We pulled up a lot of artifacts, right? A lot of stuff just coming out of the ground, a lot of domestic debris, including some, early German stoneware and a lot of pipe stems and some other materials. So basically, it was a little bit of 17th century material, quite a bit of early 18th century material, which is kind of uncommon enough, frankly. We do archaeology around the state. There's an overabundance of opportunity to dig 19th century farms. You see those old cellars all through the woods. They're kind of a dime a dozen. But when you find these buried 18th century sites, they're kind of early 18th century sites, especially. Those themselves are pretty precious. So we were excited. This was really clearly a rich site and quite early. There were hints that it might be Mason's house, but we weren't really sure at first. So to give an idea of some of the artifacts found in 2015, we've got some German stonewares. This one has a 4 scratched into it. That was, I think, a quart-sized vessel. They would scratch the numbers on them. And these are really typical Rhenish salt clay stonewares from the Rhine Valley. And the whole things look like this, right? With the Barkmann-Kruge. They've got this sort of scowling Santa Claus face on them, right? And usually this sort of medallion. And then these really nice, these are called Westerwald sherds, also German, and the whole thing would have looked like this, right? So we're finding some pretty cool stuff. Both of these forms date to the later 1600s. This guy could be with the scowling. We don't have the face. These faces get kind of uglier and more scowling as you get towards 1700. So ideally we'd find the face, we could date it a little bit better. But either way, these date to up to about 1700, and this could be anything from 1650 to 1720 or so. So it was interesting. Some nice porcelains. We don't see a lot of the proper Chinese porcelain that often, and that's probably of a more mid-18th century date. Little bits and pieces of household debris. There's a little fish scale right in the center. This is lead window caning, right? From the kind of paned windows. Little pins, beads, and fragments of beads. This is a very cool bone carved piece that might have been a part of a knife handle or something. Subsequent to this photo, we were going through all the bone pieces from this site. We found a number of additional ones, some of which fit together. So now we've got 2 big strips of that intricately carved kind of bone handle to something. And this is a little buckle fragment, perhaps from a shoe buckle. This was a very interesting find. I don't usually, as an archaeologist, care too much about coins. They're neat because they have dates stamped on them. But coins once manufactured, used, and passed around for up to a century. But in this case, this is a very, very uncommon coin. It's one of the first minted in the colonies. And it's a 1662 oak tree tuppence, so made by a couple brothers in Boston. It's a little tiny silver coin. It's smaller than a dime. I know it looks very large there, right? But a really cool thing, and one that also scared me when I realized what these go for on the open market, so I immediately handed it over to the landowner and said, please give it to the Historical Society. So, and I'm not sure if he has yet, but that's sort of the plan, is eventually that thing will be on display, hopefully with a big microscope or something, so you can magnify glass so you can see it. All right, we went back in 2016, because we really did very little work. We really spent most of the 1 week we had looking for this palisade, failing, and then spent a few days digging up little bits of that cellar. So we went back, literally dug deeper. We looked into the land records a little bit more, mostly with the help of the great folks at the Historical Society, who have done a lot of background research on the individuals who lived within the Palisade area. And basically, we know there's a lot known about Captain Mason. He's actually one of the very first to explore the Connecticut Valley, this guy, where early on, before settlement, right, 1630, and gets into Windsor by 1635, in charge of the Pequot War, but he's out of Windsor around 1647. He moves up to Saybrook and eventually to Norwich. His lot then is later sold to this guy Henry Clark, who owned the parcel to the north. And in 1655, we have, this is the important information that showed up in a land deed to Samuel Marshall, saying that the half acres of the Clark parcel was that had the dwelling house, barn, and apple trees upon it, which was John Mason's. And when we mapped all this out, so this is the bridge going into, it's Palisado Avenue. One hint that you're in the area of the Palisade, that's what this dash line is. Roughly, there's still arguments about exactly how it was organized, but it was basically roughly that. We do know exactly how long each wall was, but then you can kind of squeeze them around, right? We're worried about this kind of corner down here. We zoom in here. So this is a 3 1/4 acre parcel that matches what Clark would have had. And then this is a half acre parcel on the south end that is Mason's lot. And right there is where that cellar was. So we are quite confident that that cellar hole we found was actually the house of John Mason that the Marshall family eventually purchased and lived in until probably about 1760, maybe 1770, based on the artifacts. And then it was abandoned and filled in. By then it would have been quite an old, rundown house. We got some really interesting artifacts. So this one on the left is one we found there back in 2016. It's similar to these sort of wirework clasps that you see in the period, for example, 1630, 1650. This is one from Massachusetts, I believe, and it's roughly 1675, sort of King Philip's War period. So we see the same kind of technique being used. We don't know exactly the age, but I would say it's late 17th century probably, or mid even. So it's possible this was something that Mason himself had as a cloak clasp or something like that, or it was something that one of the Marshall family had. Now the Marshalls are not inconsequential families either. John Marshall eventually dies in 1675 in the Narragansett swamp fight. He's one of the people who succumbed during that battle, and his wife then takes the property, and their children go on to be quite successful. He owned a lot of land in town. So we ran both teachers and field school, teachers and vets field school last summer to go back to the site. We kind of took a year off, like the Ellsworth site in between. And so here we show some of the guys having fun. There's just a little 18th century button. This is how we date our pipe stems. So we use drill bits, and this is 8/64. They're measured in 64ths. In other words, it's an 1/8 drill bit, right? And it fits right down into the bore of the pipe. And if you've got one that's that fat, it dates to roughly 1620 to 1650. So that's a pipe stem that dates back to Mason's period on the site. That's kind of fun. Some interesting English slipware showing up with one of our teachers. That's a pretty little thimble, a little hard to see maybe. This is a pretty uncommon cartouche on a pipe stem. It's a sort of 4-part fleur-de-lis pattern. And these, if I'm remembering correctly, date to something like 1660 to 70. So a pretty early style. And here, what our goal was last summer was really just to take off topsoil and start exposing the cellar feature. And this is one portion probably near a hearth area where you can see a lot of rock rubble that was buried just under the ground surface. Again, no evidence of this at all on the top. It's just a backyard, right? That had been gardened and everything over the years. There were a number of post molds and everything else. So we kind of uncovered the edges of about, I think, at least a third, almost a half of this cellar feature. We kind of just wanted to start mapping it in. That was the goal. Rather than diving so deep and having an overabundance of artifacts, we said, let's do it a little simpler this year and just get the topsoil off. So, an important site. It's really, it's got a great opportunity to look at early 18th century artifacts in particular. And there's that smattering of 17th century stuff that comes out and gets us all very excited, especially when we think we might be able to tie it to John Mason himself. It's Mostly, though, I think an excellent site for teaching archaeological field schools, especially for students interested in early colonial pottery, because there's a lot of it coming out of the ground. And so the grad students that have to work on this and do all that data entry during the sort of winter semesters have a chance to really get their hands on all this material and learn it firsthand. Because again, the artifacts, the pottery that we see, English manufactured pottery mostly coming into this area, dating to between 1700 and 1750. You just don't see it that often, let alone the stuff from the 1600s. So, great little site. Now, the Styles and Ellsworth site, again, for the sake of time, we'll kind of skip a lot of the background history here, but it is likely that Francis Styles, one of the founders of Windsor, unloaded his ship somewhere near this location, and eventually he purchases this parcel and settles it himself. Now, this is the Ellsworth site before it was, or Ellsworth house before the sort of big, just columns were built on this end, and then this was added onto in the late 1790s. So this is an early view of the house. We're actually concerned with the location right out here, but this is sort of the background for those interested. I don't want to get into the kind of gory details, but basically Styles ends up selling the house to a couple different people, and eventually after 1665 it ends up in the hands of the Ellsworth family that owns it all the way up until the Daughters of the American Revolution purchase the property.
Brian,
Yes?
who would someone like Styles buy the property from initially?
He would have originally arranged that with the town founders. As one of the founders himself, he probably had first choice on what lot he was going to get. So the town was kind of allocating parcels, and the folks who settled Windsor, if you get into that history, there was a lot of dispute between three parties. The folks from Plymouth get there early on, set up the trading post, right? And then you've got the sort of Dorchester and Lords and Gentlemen groups, and so there's three people kind of fighting over the land at the same time. Eventually they sort of say, you guys are south of the river, we're going to go north of the river. And so they kind of just allocate the property. They did, especially the Plymouth folks, purchased quite a bit of land from the local tribe. And I think the other folks coming in also purchased from the local Indians, which is interesting because the Dutch, when they choose to settle Hartford, bought from the Pequots, who had just attacked the Valley Indians and claimed rights by conquest over the land. So the Dutch honored that and purchased the property at Hartford from the Pequots, whereas the English came in both Wethersfield and Windsor and bought directly from the local tribes, which angered both the Dutch and the Pequots. And that probably partly led to the Pequot War. Okay, anyway, so we've got the Ellsworths kind of growing up in this area. By 1728, there's mention of some parcels being purchased and sold off, and there's discussion of the old house on the property. And so by 1728, we know that the original house there was getting kind of run down and old. This is the beautiful Ralph Earl painting. Abigail, I think she was a Wolcott. Anyone else know that history? And Oliver, an important person. I mean, this is really a great site. It's a historic, National Historic Landmark site. So if you get a chance to get out there, have you been to the Ellsworth house for a tour? Definitely make an effort to go out there. And an important person in American history. But we're gonna, let me zoom in. Let's see if we'll do that. I gotta go forward, there we go. So this is looking out the window. So this is the sort of Dali-esque thing where they're sitting in their house and looking out the window and that's their house in the background. All right, so we're gonna zoom in on that. And there's the Ellsworth house. We see this addition on this side is already there, and the pillars are not in place that you would see today. We're worried about a site right here. This is where we dug. So there's no sign of it in 1792 when that painting was made. Not even any rubble. So we went out there with radar. A lot of work had been done in 1990 and then a field school run in 1991 by UConn. So there had been some good documentation done about the fact that this Styles house was somewhere on the south lawn of this property. And so we wanted to, using radar, now that was available to us, that wouldn't have been available to them in 1990, we went over the south lawn area and ended up with a map like this. So this is in meters. Each of these is a 10-meter kind of shift, right? 0, 10, 20, 30. But there's a big space here, and this is, I forget the exact numbers, but it's something like 24 by at least 12 feet across. It is a big hole in the ground. So that green blob is disturbed soils, and that goes down like 5, almost 6 feet in the radar. You can see how deep that disturbance was. So, and there were a couple other weird features that kind of stood out. did a little testing here, a little testing there, but we really focused on this kind of corner area. And in this case, this was the teacher's dig, right? So we only had a week, and then we spent another week kind of working with other members of the public and the local historic society to come out. But we found some really interesting ceramics. These are not like the ones you usually see in the local dumps around here, the transfer printed wares, right? This is what we're talking, these kind of greenish glazed, funny slipped dot patterns. This is early stuff. Maybe could date into the early 1700s, but is arguably older than that. What we're finding in a lot of these sites that date to just before and around 1700 is this beautiful Staffordshire slipped ware. This is a very fine combed technique, and the full vessel might have looked something like this. And this is that little portion here that we're seeing there, where it's like they would paint lines around it and then take that very fine tooth comb and just make a jig pattern. And I tell students, it's like if you're getting your fancy cappuccino, they can make the swirly patterns on the top. It's the same way. If you're a potter, you know how to do this kind of effect on pottery. You can see this is what archaeologists never find. I wish they had. They are in museums, but a nice dated vessel, that would be cool. That is not from the site. That is just an example in a museum. But this is, potentially what that thing could have looked like. A little book clasp, a little glass trade deed, which is interesting. And this, does anyone know what that little piece is? Any of you guys that might be metal detectors might know this fragment of metal. It's your test. Okay, it's this part. So it's this end part of a latinum. That's the latinum is just the type of metal it is. And so these date to 1650, 1670 or so. So that's a pretty early spoon that we found, just kind of digging around the area of that old cellar hole. We also found, this is one of the most intriguing artifacts that came out of there. It's a very strange little brass token. You can see this sort of funny cross pattern with the triangular terminals and dots in there, rows of dots, some fleur-de-lis things going on here, and a cross. It frankly very much looks like a medieval coin, but it's not really a coin. It's some kind of token, a trade token of some type. I have sent this to folks in England and all over, and no one yet knows how old this is. What I think that the best explanation is that in say, the 1630s, Styles was provided a sack of these kind of brass tokens to use as currency in the new colony. And maybe they were even 200 years old at the time. I don't know. Or if you want to believe Normans came over, I don't know, settled there and left some stuff. I don't think so, though. I think we'll have to imagine this. It's an odd coin-like object, though. This on the right was found in 1990, and that's a Jesuit ring. So there's the I and H and S on there. And that's a really kind of interesting thing to see. That's the type of artifact that Kevin McBride would find associated with the Pequot War. These were very common trade items that many Native American people were wearing. Probably the Puritans in Windsor were not wearing Jesuit rings, right? But they were trade items. For all we know, though, they were trading them to the local Indians. The assumption has always been that somehow the French were trading these, right, with their contacts up in the north. But I think we just don't know yet. They're fairly common, at least on native sites. We don't see them on historic sites that often. It suggests there's trade, though, happening. The beads sort of underscore that as well. So this is a little bit of what we found archaeologically. There's the west edge of the cellar here, very near the corner. The corner was coming around here. So that showed up quite nicely, a little remnant there. Up in the southeast corner, we just hit a soil stain. So there was no evidence of the wall. And in fact, digging through this area is what we're looking at down here. There was nothing to see until we got almost 6 feet down, and that final course of laid sort of sandstone blocks was left in place. In other words, this cellar was totally robbed out and then just backfilled. So someone went to the effort to take all the stone out of the old cellar when that house was being torn apart and probably reused it in a new construction on the site somewhere nearby. The artifacts suggest that that would have happened sometime shortly after 1740, because we really don't see any of the typical artifacts that start showing up after 1740 in the cellar fill. So I think what's going on is that Oliver's father, and I think this is David, had rebuilt the house around 1740, but there's arguments about that. Everyone's focused on a roughly 1783 date for the Oliver Ellsworth site that you see today. Though some of the older documents do suggest that maybe parts of that building were built in the 1740s. And to me right now, that's what the archaeology suggests. We have one old house being torn down, something new on the property being built around 1740, and then Oliver gets the parcel once he's a kind of relatively wealthy and successful man and really makes a mansion out of the place. So that's what we're left with. We're going to jump down to Glastonbury. So the Hollister site in Glastonbury has really been taking a lot of my time, and I'm really happy to give it a lot of my energy during the last, it's been almost 4 years. John Hollister himself is fairly well documented as an individual. He was a very wealthy landowner in early Wethersfield. He marries into the Treat family, a very important family in Glastonbury, Wethersfield at the time as well. The Treats do own property on the Glastonbury side of the river, as well as on the old Wethersfield side. They're both considered sirs, which back in the 1600s meant you were a pretty special kind of guy. There's an important element here that the farm was actually tenant farm between 1651 and 1663 by the Gilbert family. I have a whole other set of slides that I'm not giving you guys today that gets into the history of the Gilberts and how many animals they had on the farm and other things like that. But we know that Hollister dies in 1665, that his house, barn, and orchard and pasture was given to John Jr. John marries in 1667 into the Goodrich family, another well-standing family in town, and he there has 10 children and dies in 1711. So this is the probate transcription, and there's a lot of interesting stuff here. So his Noag, so that's today Naog, right? House and barn, orchard and pasture, valued at 200 pounds, 60 acres of plowing and mowing land, and other lands, 300 pounds. This is probably all in Glastonbury, I think. A mare and a horse, 4 oxen. So the oxen are your tractors, right? And the plow, harrow, iron, so all sorts of other husbandry tools. Wheat and Indian corn stored in the chamber, valued at 22 pounds, 2 beds and furniture and other household goods. Now it starts listing additional animals. I think the 9 cows, the 29 small swine, young cattle, 4 yearlings, 7 sheep, and 3 calves. This may have been in the old Wethersfield side. So this probate includes everything on all his properties, right? So the main family household at this time of his death was an old Wethersfield. The lease with the Gilbert family had run out just a couple years before. He's probably starting to work the land himself again when he unfortunately passes away at a fairly young age. Down here we also have 20 acres of wheat sown in Naog. So this is actually really important documentation of like what they're growing on the land, right? We just don't see this. What is it? But we see Indian corn, we see wheat, corn standing on the land of 23 acres, and then this I like too, in wampum, 10 pounds. So that's like a little chest of wampum beans. Now it's interesting, the 1665 is kind of getting to be a late date for the mention of wampum. After this period, because the beaver trade is kind of falling apart, the value of wampum is sort of collapsing in the market. And so we don't see wampum. It's just not worth mentioning in probates that much anymore after 1670 or so. But we see that and actually the fact that he had wampum, it doesn't mean he was taking part in native trade necessarily. But these little shell beads were used as basically coinage in the colonies at that time because they just didn't have what they call specie, right, coinage available to them. All right, so his whole estate is valued at over 1,600 pounds. And if you guys are familiar with 17th century documents, a fairly well, or at least let's say successful farmer might have had 200 pounds worth of stuff in his probate. So this is a really wealthy, fairly influential man. This is the animals on his farm. So what we see is in addition to all the wheat and corn and everything else he's growing, there's a lot of livestock here, right? Now again, they're not probably all on the Glastonbury side. I think, for example, the sheep, it would have been risky to keep them east of the river. East of the river was the wilderness. Basically, anyone east of the river is living with Indians. And wild animals, the wolves and wild cats and things like that. So I think these critters are a little bit more vulnerable, and the young calves and things like that, you might have kept it on the west side of the river until they got bigger. The oxen and cattle could probably fend for themselves fairly well. But this is a big farm. And I think when we think of colonial age farming, we don't always, especially the early years, we don't always think of this sort of major focus on livestock. But if you read the documents about people living outside of Boston, one of the first things they do is start getting those cattle ranches going. because everyone needs not only the meat, but they also are producing cattle for the new people coming in, and they can all start their own farms. There's a market for it, let alone in the Caribbean at this point, right? So they're probably salting a lot of the products of these animals and sending them down. Okay, a quick kind of summary of the years we were out here. We only spent a day digging in 2015 with the Glastonbury Historical Society. They have kind of one-day public dig they run, and I agreed to try to find this site finally. But what we did is the day before, I went out there with a guy named Peter Leach, who at the time was a grad student at UConn, and he ran his radar unit across the site and found all these weird blobs. So this is a big cellar here, this is another cellar here, this is a big cellar here, and then there's some funny shaped cellar feature over here as well. That's a well. These are big pits that run in a line here. There's something strange here going on, and more pits and other things. And then we've done additional work down here. So we did magnetometry work, and we won't go into that too much. Additional radar expanding over large area all around here. And we spent, in 2016, that was a pretty important year because we released these red squares. We focused on these cellars. So we trenched out roughly 2 to 3 meters into each of these cellars to understand the stratigraphy and really understand the artifacts of the site better. The 2015 dig suggested there might be an old site here, like maybe we were actually on the right spot. They tried to find it like 4 years before, but weren't very successful, partly because the weather was bad. They had to dig a tree line because it was too hot. So we had a chance to dig into these finally and actually locate them with the radar. Great technology, perfect soils, by the way. It doesn't work so well everywhere, but there's no stones in this. It's just glacial sand, so everything shows up quite nicely. And diving into that, we found just lots of stuff. So we really verified in 2016 that we were dealing with a nice second half 17th century site. This is an animation of what the radar looks like as it goes down into the ground. Here's your depth, and it's around 1 meter down. You see those squares really pop out, right? So it's going to kind of just cycle through here. But sort of pay attention, that's that eastern sort of cellar, these 3 other cellars, okay? And there's lots of other weird stuff going on. There's another well out over here if it shows up. But I think this is kind of neat to sort of see how the radar sees down into the ground. And it's actually working in strips, and then the computer puts all those strips together, and then it can slice them into layers, and that's kind of what we're putting together here. But I think that kind of gives you a sense of how we're using this to do it. And this is on a now well-established grid. We used a total station to lay out the entire site grid. So when we see a feature that we're curious about, like a corner, we can go out there, lay the stakes in, and land right on top of it, exactly. It's really nice to have that control. All right, so what did we get at the Hollister site? So we knew this guy's fairly well-to-do, which makes it kind of interesting, because what does a fairly well-off farmer in the 1600s in the Connecticut Valley have in his cupboards? One of the things we were kind of excited to find was this great example. I'm going to say maybe the biggest piece of Italian marbleized slipware that I'm familiar with in New England. There's some pieces of this that have been found in Maine, a couple outside of Boston. A couple were just found at the Webking-Stevens dig, smaller fragments, but this is a beautiful portion of the bowl. Now we have found other smaller pieces of this in numerous other cellars. So this is not just sort of a one-off object. It was pretty obvious that the family had a lot of this stuff in their cupboards. These are a variety of pipe stem, and what's important is to see the typical white clay stems, but there's also these red manufactured ones, just a local clay pipe. And some of them are even brown in color. This is my favorite pipe bowl from the site to date. It's got this rouletting, they call it, very typical of the Bristol manufacturing technique. And it's got these little swish marks on it. So the rouletting was done with a little wheel, like a little toothed wheel. So they would put the clay in a pipe mold, open the mold up. Once it was just dry enough to handle, they would just decorate the rim of that pipe bowl like that. So if you see these rouletted rims, you're dealing with 17th century pipes. They stopped doing that later. But I like this little swish. It's just a very personal touch on the pipe. The pipe stem would have gone off in that direction. And that's a little heel on the pipe. Interesting tin glazed earthenware. This might be something called a Persian blue. This is the base of an apothecary jar that would kind of come across up on both sides. So kind of a medicine jar that had a lid. And very interesting, we got large pieces of Native American fragments. Mostly in one cellar, but a couple other smaller pieces came out of one of the other cellars, and it was very clear that this was a native storage vessel that the Hollister family had in their possession suggestions that Lieutenant Hollister even had a wrestling match with one of the local Indian chiefs or something, and they wrestled all day and then became best friends. So we have these sort of weird anecdotes about the relationship between the Hollister family and the local tribal members. But artifacts like that really bring it home. This is probably a sleigh bell cap. Very interesting, just a little brass bell. But you can see the decoration on it, really quite nicely made. That was a crushed kettle. I like to say the cow stepped on it, right? And this is, again, one of these Latin spoons. So before, at the Ellsworth site, we had the terminal end, but this is sort of the bowl of the spoon. It's got a little stamp in there with a triple spoon mark. So we know these are made, again, roughly 1650, 1670-ish, okay? Glass window pane. So they were wealthy enough to have some glass windows in this house, which at this period were pretty uncommon. But what intrigued me more is this is an exact replica in mica. Look at that, right? The same exact angles and geometry. And the mica was probably just pulled out of the local rocks up in, the South Glastonbury, Portland area where there's a lot of mica to be found in big sheets. Again, the early pipe stems, where there's our drills, 1620, 1650, a beautiful red trade bead. Perhaps, again, suggesting that interaction with the native people in the area. We had, the cellars, in particular, two, were very, very rich in both animal bone and plant remains, and things like fish scales. The preservation was phenomenal. Like these delicate little fish scales, you would not think that would survive 350 years, but it was all there. But what we found was actually really interesting. The site's dominated by maize, beans, and hickory nut shells, making the diet of the individuals on the Hollister farm look very, very indigenous, native, right? There is a little tiny bit of wheat, there's some grape and possible domestic cherry, but it's frankly the hickory nuts and maize that dominate the plant food assemblage. When we look at the bones that come out of the site, we really get the same picture. 47%, and this is an early count, there's work still being done on the bones as they come out, was deer. Like half of the food they ate was probably venison. And then there's a lot of fish, including some cod, so we're not just getting freshwater fish out there, and a lot of shellfish fragments. And again, the shellfish are not like Connecticut River freshwater mussels. These are all coastal shell that someone's hauling up in boats, probably packed in seaweed in a barrel, right, coming up the river and selling them. People are often surprised, but we see a lot of shellfish on these early sites. People in Hartford or whatever eating a lot of shellfish along the site. A lot of small animals as well. Turkey, it's interesting to see some turkey. About 25% of the bones were domestic animals, European things, cow, horse, pig, and sheep. This is a bear paw bone, and it's a little arthritic joint there, so that was a big, angry old bear. And it's interesting to think how the bear bone got into the site. Was it one of the Hollister boys just hunting up in the woods? Did they trade an Indian for a big bear pelt that still had the hands on it, right? Who knows? But again, it shows you this is the wilderness, so there's animals like bears running around, and of course we're starting to see that again now that the forests have come back. But what we ultimately were seeing is a diet dominated by indigenous food resources again, so it's really backing up what we're finding from the plant food remains. Some of the pipes, you guys probably are pretty familiar with finding pipe fragments and pipe bowls even in your gardens. Certainly in areas like this that are occupied only after about 1700, you're still going to find a lot of these are in very common use throughout even the 1800s. But this is sort of the classic form, the simple elbow pipe here. And I'm going to argue these look rather different than the ones you're going to find up in Hebron. Some of them have round bowls. Again, that's our early one with the round sort of pot-belly bowl to it. But most of them are very simple shape. Some of them are stamped. But again, what we do is we use we have, I don't know now, probably, we used to have about 6 feet of pipe stems if you put them end to end, and we're probably up to 9 feet by now. If you measure all those pipe stem diameters, it gives you the average date. The interesting thing is it comes back closer to 1650 than say 1700, or maybe the mid-range from the site you might expect it to be 1675. And it's a little tricky to interpret. This could be that the pipe stem dating method isn't a very precise one. It needs to be adjusted a little bit for whatever reasons. But I kind of have a sneaking suspicion that it's the Gilbert family who leased the farm, who were the big smokers here. And when John Hollister's son, John, moves in 1667, perhaps he's just not a big smoker. Perhaps he's a little bit more of a Puritan and there were laws on the books against smoking at this time, and so perhaps he really is not the one leaving most of these pipes behind, and in fact they reflect that earlier Gilbert occupation. Hardly any coins from the site. There's two exceptions. So one is this Charles I farthing. Charles is the guy who lost his head in the Revolution, right? And these coins were then sort of abandoned in England, but probably continued to be used in the colonies for a little while. But this is an early coin, dating to roughly 1640. It's in pretty darn good condition, so it wasn't rubbing around in someone's pocket for very long. So it may have entered the ground by, say, 1650. Again, hinting that someone was on this farm as early as 1640, and that's where our paper records are a little bit weak. Some different beads. That's a trade bead, a strange little glass bead, a drilled shell. That's kind of interesting. We might expect that on a Native American site. A very tiny seed bead, a little brass bead, and these are both glass beads, so they kind of look like wampum. We see a number of glass beads kind of in the form of wampum, which suggests to me that the manufacturers in Europe are starting to fabricate wampum-like glass beads for trade. So this is our cellars. This is getting into the meat of it. The north cellar had big blocky stones. A lot of it's collapsed. There's all the rubble fill. And not a lot. You can see in the walls are fairly clean. You don't see a lot of bone or anything sticking out here. So we didn't find a ton of artifacts. A fair amount of window glass, though, was coming out of this area. The center cellar had a different type of stone structure. It was sort of slabby, flat stone, suggesting it was built at a different time than the north cellar. And then in the south cellar, this is just soil. And the reason you're just looking at soil with some interesting horizons running through it, and I'll show you another picture of those. These are soil sediment samples we took here. This was it turned out when we got into the details of this, a plank-lined cellar. So there was no stone foundation at all here. It was basically a pit dug in the ground. Posts were placed in the corner. That's one of the corner posts. And along this edge that you see kind of cut out here, there's a brown stain. That's where some kind of like oak plank was put in. And they would have stacked those planks up behind probably 4 corner posts, and that would have held back the earth and made your simple cellar. So perhaps that's the oldest cellar at the site. In the fill of that cellar, there was a huge, just bone, like debris horizon. So the shell sticking out of half of the deer skull there, a lot of stuff. At the very bottom of the cellar, which ends here, this is the corner of our excavation. That's glacial sands, the nice pink soils. But that's a layer of, there's a brown layer, the kind of working area of the bottom of the cellar probably, and then this ashy zone of fill. And we had some of that looked at. In fact, there were some interesting burned, this is with phytoliths, I don't want to get into all that, but burnt wheat husk fragments coming out. Just an example of one of the refits on some of the bowls. This was a young woman did some work in the lab a couple of years back. The interesting thing is there were 6 fragments that make up this shirt, and they come from 2 separate cellars. So that suggests that these 2 cellars were both at least filled in at the same time, rather than one maybe being built in 1650 and filled in 1670, and then the other one being abandoned and filled in 1711, right? If you find 2 refitted pieces from a bowl, they probably were all just stuff on the surface, and they just ended up kind of getting in the different cellar holes. So that's kind of interesting little details. There's some more examples of our Italian slip decorated ware. It's beautiful stuff. It's just really remarkable artistic stuff, and it's just amazing to kind of hold that. A fair amount of what we would call Delftware or tin glazed earthenware coming out. But again, very attractive. Big platters. So this is a fairly large fragment like this. It would have probably come from a plate about that big around. This is the underside. You can kind of see some of these have a greenish glaze on the back. This is probably a manganese painted portion. Very delicate stuff like this. The tin glaze whereas the glaze tends to flake off, so you have to be really careful when you're taking it out of the ground. It kind of just falls apart. This is a sort of a polychrome piece, probably a floral decoration, big stripy bits. There's others that I've kind of skipped. Moving forward, not a lot of the German stoneware, but again, like we saw at the Mason site, we're getting this kind of typical stippled stoneware look, and that's what these full guys look like. Some lighter colored vessels that grade into the whites, and this might be the stuff called Huvenware. And then this is the vestibule, the blue, right? And these are some little shards of that here. So and that would be a typical assemblage from around, you see George Rex, George I. So let's just say around 1700. We saw the pipes. This is we get the same slide in there twice? All right, we'll move forward. That's me throwing things together too fast. We used what's called a portable X-ray fluorescence meter to look at glazes and look at some of the pipe clays to understand them better. And what we learned is that these are rather toxic. So this is lead, and it's just showing on the meter from the device over the 10%. Sulfur, and the SN is the tin, so that's the tin glaze, where this is from manganese piece, calcium, sodium, things like that. Chlorine, arsenic, right? That's nice too. So when we look at this, the numbers are pretty scary. So this is actually 32% lead coming through on the glaze there. That's what makes it so beautiful and shiny, right? We can't use lead glazes anymore in what we eat off of because it wasn't very good for you. I don't know how much toxicity you get like from eating off of it regularly. It's baked in there pretty good, but for whatever reason they decided that we shouldn't be eating off that type of powder anymore. So there's some really interesting other English types, these yellow glazed wares, but they're also loaded with lead, and even this little earthenware piece here loaded with lead. The only things that are actually safe to eat off of, this is an example of the German stoneware, like no lead, essentially nothing. This is in the arsenic levels. And again, this is an interesting stoneware that is perhaps an English one, but hardly any lead in that either. So if you ever go back in time, stick to the German stonewares if you're eating and drinking something. What the chemistry of all these, I got kind of fascinated by just having done a little pottery back in the day. My dad's a potter, thinking about how skillful these early English potters and the Germans were at manufacturing their glazes, their glaze recipes basically. The fact that they could isolate these compounds in the 1600s and develop these kind of wonderfully decorated pottery. So this is really the days of, it's pre-science, right? This is the period of alchemy. They're really trying to understand how nature works. But alchemy was important for advancing these kind of ideas in mining and metallurgy in particular, but medicine in particular, we'll see, dyes. And the whole concept was to improve the human spirit as well as the national economy. That's quite clear in a lot of the alchemical writings. And Walt Woodward here, who is your state historian, hopefully you've had Walt speak sometime for you. He's a great speaker. But he wrote this wonderful book about John Wycliffe Jr., our governor from the mid-1600s, who was himself an alchemist, and kind of a medical alchemist in particular. But part of the ideas that he gained from his alchemical experiments were that he should be more tolerant of other people's religious perspectives, and for example, really put an end to the burning of witches in Connecticut during his period here. So, and we can see in his sort of experimentation too, the origin perhaps of this Yankee spirit of inventiveness, right? And in his case, he was focused, again, like the other alchemists, on these ideas of social and economic improvement in the colony. All right, so getting back to some of the results of the radar, Maeve Herrick was writing her master's thesis after doing all that radar work out there. These are the cellars kind of highlighted in bright blue blocks. There's the well, the east cellar, this other weird blob, we'll ignore for now. And one of the important things that came of her work was the identification of another little cellar down way south of the core area of the site you can investigate, right? And then these three strange, what appear to be oval-shaped blobs right near it. And she and her advisor really thought that these were probably Native American house floors. And they kind of dipped down into the ground like this. So we really, after her thesis came out in 2017, we wanted to focus on this area last summer in 2018 and see what was going on. But first off, we kind of explored some of the other radar anomalies. This is an interesting pit feature that there's many, many of out there. And then this is another with a mortar circle in the middle. And when you dig these up, the one looks like this with the mortar, which is basically mortar probably poured into a barrel that had a chestnut post sticking out of it. And that is part of a tobacco shed post, okay? We know they're all spaced exactly one bent apart, 16 feet, boom, boom, boom. They line up perfectly. We know from the 1934 aerial, you can see that tobacco shed still standing right there until the flood came and wiped it out. But the other posts were just plain. It's a little harder to see, not super clean, but this went down deep in the ground. And these may be the structural posts that were part of the architecture of the 17th century house. So discriminating between these things was one of the challenges we were kind of facing in 2017. And we'll get into some of the artifacts like Llewellyn Evans pipe, These red clay pipe bowls now we're getting more of. Very interesting to see this. And one of the clues, one of the things we wanted to check on with the XRF study that we did was whether or not these might be made in the Connecticut Valley. We know some are being made down in Maryland and Virginia. There's some suspicion that they're being made outside of Boston, perhaps. But our red local Connecticut Valley clays would have been really good for making these pipes, and perhaps we had a pipe maker somewhere not too far from here, because we get an awful lot of these red clay pipe fragments. Again, more of that Staffordshire ware we talked about from the Ellsworth site, really pretty pieces. As we got to the bottom of that south cellar that Maeve Herrick had found, we found this wonderful sort of bottle fragment. It looked like it was going to be a whole vessel, but here was a big piece that came out. That's what we're looking at there, a big jug handle. And we found enough sherds, even in this small area that we excavated, that we were able to put a lot of that vessel together. So here's the handle, kind of has a globular shape. It probably came out with, I don't know whether it was a spout or sort of a bottle top. Hopefully we find more. It's a very interesting ceramic. I've showed it to a lot of other archaeologists, even from down south. And they don't know what to call this either. It has a very metallic sheen to it. I suspect it's an early English stoneware of some type. So they're taking the ideas from the German stoneware manufacturers and starting to produce their own. But it's not a classic early English stoneware, so no one knows what they're going to call it and stuff. All right, down the cellar again, more tube-like earthenware. Just such pretty stuff, right? Here's like a nice maybe pomegranate or peach with the leaf on it. Beautifully hand-painted pieces. That's a little bowl fragment. More of the Italian slip decorated ware, tiny fragment. This one has some of the green that you sometimes get. A couple of wampum beads. There's my predecessor, Nick, helping us out. He spoiled everyone's fun by finding all the wampum beads at the site. We're using an 1/8" screen, by the way, which is a very, very fine mesh because we want to make sure we're gathering these little tiny artifacts. I'm not going to dwell on this, but this 5/64 stem, that's a very narrow pipe stem. That is a pipe stem that is long. So narrow bore diameter, very long. Probably dates to after 1720, and it was down in that cellar fill, in that south cellar. Now, many of the other artifacts date to as early as 1650. I kind of suspect that this was a pipe that one of the young guys who was out there shoveling and filling in the cellar around 1720 was smoking out of, and when it broke, whatever, he just chucked it down in the hole. I don't think it was part of the actual habitation. It's the latest artifact from the whole site right now. Other things, bottom of a nice little medicine bottle. This is the base of one of these German stoneware jugs. Again, we haven't yet found one of those faces. We know if we dig more, we'll eventually get one. This is a really interesting pipe. It's called a Crusader and Huntress style. It's a little hard to see here, but there's a female figurine and a dog, and there's a little rabbit somewhere over here, and on the other side there's a guy standing with a pike. Most recently, it's believed that these are probably manufactured in France. They show up at Fort Pentagouet in Maine around the 1670s. They also show up in St. Mary's City, Maryland, which was not a French outpost, but a Catholic one, and there were strong ties to France. So we don't know for sure, and right now I think this is the only one of these in all of southern New England. They used to be considered Dutch. The problem is none of them were ever found in New York, where the Dutch were. And they kind of arguably say they postdated the Dutch occupation if they're in the 1670s. I kind of wonder about the connections in some of the fighting that's happening in northern New England, and some of our guys on this site are taking part in military activities. If this somehow wasn't picked up either on a raid up into Maine or picked up off an Indian that they had captured or something else like that and ended up at this site. So sometimes these little individual artifacts can they raise interesting questions, and there's a story behind it, you just can't quite figure out what it was. All right, so those wigwam features, right? What was going on? 2 years ago, we dug a single 1 meter square, and we got stuff like this out of it, suggesting that all these red earthenware fragments and a little bit of delft were typical pipe stems. These would average to about 1650 in age, suggesting this was clearly contemporaneous with the whole farmstead that we had been excavating. This was not if it was a wigwam feature, it didn't date to 1000 AD or something. We also found this big chunk of deer skull and antler at the bottom, which really had our hopes up because that seemed more like a Native American thing that might be on your house floor, right? So we were the idea was maybe this is a native encampment right there on the farm, and that these folks are hired by the Hollister family to help work on the farm, especially when young John Hollister, who inherits it, had just young children, he would have needed extra hands. So we went back in 2018 to really focus on this wigwam feature. This is a Philip Edwards pipe, also from around the 1660s or so when he gets his license to make pipes. You see all the process of sorting the artifacts as we're doing the excavation work. This is Peter Leach, who ran that original survey, ground penetrating radar survey work. And that's not a Tonka truck, that is a miniature radar device that's a very high frequency and actually only sees about a foot or so down into the ground, but it sees in great detail. So he wanted to experiment with it on the site. He loves the site, and it's a chance for him to play with his new toys, basically, even though that costs far more than a Tonka truck. All right, so here's a drone view of the block we opened up on the left. And what I want to highlight here is, if you can see it, there's a brown line like this. It goes around like this. So rather than finding an oval-shaped wigwam, we found a very rectangular hole in the ground. And we pretty quickly realized that we were probably dealing with an English cellar rather than a wigwam after all. This was our kind of find of the summer last summer. That is I believe, if I'm remembering the date right, 1693 coin minted in Yemen. Coins like this were brought back by pirates to Newport, Rhode Island by the sackful and ended up in circulation. By around 1700 though, anyone caught with coins like this could be arrested and hung as a pirate, so they quickly sort of fell out of use. And there we have one at the Hollister site. Kind of cool. So these guys were getting licenses to kind of harass the French off the west coast of Africa. Many of them got bored and decided to go around to the east side and attack these Mogul ships going back and forth between India, the Indian Empire, and Arabia at the time. So pretty cool. We actually had all this translated by a guy who specializes in it, and I can't remember. He says it's this coin is minted in the reign of so-and-so, and I guess I should put all that up there eventually. That's just a little glass bead, but yeah, again, tying the site to piracy. I didn't know this whole story of pirates in the 1690s, but it turns out there's a lot of actually interesting literature on this. Best example of one of our red clay pipe holes so far came out as well. Our first thimble from this site, a beautiful little thimble. It's interesting because it kind of brings up an anecdotal story that's in the archives of Glastonbury Historical Society. We don't know when this was written, but it's sort of a little typed up page about how the Hollister family took care of an Indian girl and taught her how to sew. And she taught them how to skin animals and things like that. We have no idea if this is pure fiction or not, but there it is. It's in the archives. And it's neat to see this very tiny thimble. And it kind of, at least, if nothing else, raises that story and brings it out a little bit. Now this thing on the right is a little hard to see. This came out of the bottom of the cellar. It is about this big. It is a honking piece of iron. There is the hole for your handle, and basically this is a mattock. So this is a giant digging tool. And this is exactly what these guys would have been using to dig out their cellars or do other kind of really tough ground-breaking work on the farm. And for whatever reason, it seemed to be in pretty good shape. It's not like this split out or anything. It was just tossed at the very bottom of the cellar. And left behind. At the very bottom of the cellar, pretty much, we also found this beautiful piece of tin glazed earthenware. This is called the Chinese scholar motif, and these were very popular, made both in Holland and in London. In roughly 1675 is sort of when these sort of peak in use. But really, again, one of my favorite shirts from the site, just really well done, right? Just there's other versions of this pottery where those little figures are not as nicely executed. This is a fine example of that pottery. So on the right, we see the stratigraphy of that wigwam part, right? The other cellar that we looked at the year before is just a couple meters away. You can see these draping sediments that go down into the bottom, full of ash, rock rubble, and ceramics now and then. Here is this lighter soil is the slumped in edges. So as we excavated out here too, we were able to get really clear indication of that flank wall. Again, that had rotted out down there, leaving it kind of a brown, just edgy stain. So again, we were dealing with one of these wood-lined cellars that when they rot out, you can only imagine, right? They're going to rot out pretty quickly, and they kind of slump in, and all this subsoil just fills in. You're left with this kind of depression then after that. So after the roof is gone and everything else, this slumping begins. And perhaps 10 or 20 years later, somebody came out and took apart the chimney and just dumped all this junk in here. So this is probably hearth remains all that ash when we see it like that in a layer. Above it here we have some floodplain sediments that start filling in too, and then the modern plow zone. And again, you see there's no indication anymore that there's anything down there. It's only the radar that got us to this spot. All right, so in terms of architecture, quickly, we're wondering what's happening. This is our main site area. These three cellars are very much in alignment. I would suggest they're part of a single large house called a cross passage style house, or West Country style house. The Hollister family is a West Country family. That's that sort of southwestern part of England, getting towards Cornwall. And I think it's possible this is one single structure that probably grew over time, right? We know that the construction method is different in these two cellars. And that's our southern cellar with the plank lining that may have been the first. So this thing probably grew, but in the end, it may have been as much as 90 feet long. So a big, big, long house, rather tremendous sized house. There's precedents for houses like this. Down in Jamestown, they have this structure they call the factory with an earthen cellar at one end and a fireplace here. In the Phipps site, which is quite interestingly comparable to ours in Maine, they've got one that's 70-something feet long here, and then here in Andover, not far away, you may have heard of the Sprague House, which built in 1700 or so was really probably the last structure in the colonies ever to be built in this more medieval fashion. These are basically kind of a medieval style house form. This is not like your hall and parlor house that we're familiar with, right? Though they have a hall and a parlor to them. There's the parlor end, there's the central hall, and there's the pantry side, the service area. These houses might have looked something like this at the Hollister site. I like this little sketch that I found. And basically, they're precedented by these houses built in the West Country. This is more in the, say, 1550s. So it has a service area, the central hall passage, and what's called the hall, and then your parlor is your private area with the sleeping area, right with the bed. At this time, there was still just a central fire pit in the hall, and that was sort of a working area. And it's not until about 1600 that they started learning, making chimneys better, and then they put a floor over these panels and create like a second floor in that space. So by the time people are coming into New England in the 1630s or so, they're already, they have a more advanced building style than this predecessor here. So they're building houses with chimneys, they're putting in a second floor and things like that. But this is the core concept of those cross passage or West Country style cottages. But another type of farm architecture to keep in mind is the Ray Rossiter farmstead down in Guilford. I think it's Desborough was the original owner. Rossiter comes down from Windsor and purchases it. And this reconstruction is a sketch is based on a 1651 sketch drawing of how this area was laid out. So you've got sort of a palisaded yard, the main house, a big house, arguably, 2 floors here. There's a horse paddock and a place for the cattle, a hay barn, the beer and bread making areas over here, and a place for smaller animals like the pigs or chickens. Orchards, a spring house with a stream running through. This is actually based on these bonds in Ireland. And so as the English are colonizing the New World, they're also colonizing Northern Ireland. And they learn to manufacture these kind of fortified farms in Northern Ireland. And they kind of transfer that style to New England, probably. Now, we don't see it everywhere, but it's possible the Hollister farm, we know it is palisaded from historical documents in 1675 during King Philip's War. So perhaps it had this kind of layout to some degree as well. Okay, so the Hollister farm, my favorite site. I'm so lucky to have had a chance to be working on that. We will be out there again this summer. But it's just, I don't know how to emphasize this enough. We do not have sites from the 17th century in Connecticut. This is all brand new information. The Webdean-Stevens dig is providing a little bit more to go with this. Kevin McBride's work on the Pequot War battlefield, withdrawal marches and things like that is providing the military artifacts from the period. But this is all so new. We're not like Virginia, Maryland, Massachusetts is a little ahead. Maine is even ahead of us in 17th century artifacts, right, and archaeology. So Connecticut has some catching up to do, which is why I wanted to make this a priority for my work in the coming years. So we have remarkable preservation of artifacts. Hopefully we'll learn a little bit more about the architecture. Some of that's speculative still. But as we decode those big giant posts, hopefully we'll understand how this house was built and whether or not the cellars are really linked together or not. basically, one of the most important things is we're getting clear evidence of the cooperation between this English family and their native neighbors. And in particular, we're seeing how native lifeways are influencing the English, at least in terms of their diet. And this just makes all the sense in the world. If you're raising a lot of livestock, you're not going to eat it all if you can send your boys in the woods to hunt deer all day, at least part of the day, because they've still got farm work to do, right? Or, you know, purchase deer from your native neighbors and things like that. I like to think about this time, though, especially at Hollister, in the frontier side of the river, where these kids are growing up with native people their own age. They're running around those forests of Glastonbury. They're probably running all the way up to here, right? Exploring the area, learning the native language, learning the native foodways, and bringing that home. And it's after about 1700 that really disappears. For example, the Mason and Ellsworth site, we don't get the wild game so much anymore. It's all just domestic animal. Perhaps that's because it's on the west side of the river, the civilized side, right? But that knowledge kind of fades away, and the kids are no longer growing up with Indians after 1700 so much, right? They've been confined to reservations, and they're often dying off of disease even more. So it's a really interesting look into life at this time. I guess this is a lot of the folks I should thank, the folks at the Ellsworth House, FOSA members, of course, for providing a lot of mentorship of the people taking part in these food schools. Tons of participants who did all the work, especially all the folks, also folks who are working in the lab during the winter semesters for us getting through these artifacts. It is a burden to go through all those artifacts and get everything cataloged. You've got 20,000 fish scales to count, right? It takes time. But if you want to see more, if you're on Facebook, you can even go there if you're not on Facebook. You can just look up CT Archaeology. That's where I put all my updates, and there's a lot of archival stuff. You can go back through the records, see videos and things from the site. And there's also information at OSA, Office of State Archaeology, at UConn.edu. I've got a lot of pictures and some write-ups. All right,